Hello and welcome to the Cuyamaga Institute, our Q&A Conversation for Exploration series. I'm Paul Robert, the Executive Director and President of the Institute, along with my wife, Laura Lee, the Director of Research, Education, and Outreach. And on behalf of our Board of Directors, advisors, volunteers, and supporting members, we want to thank you for joining us today. The Cuyamaga Institute's an independent nonprofit research organization committed to researching consciousness and the human experience, following the footsteps of our founder, anthropologist Dr. Felicitas Goodman, And our focus is reflected in three main areas: experience, education, and exploration. We respect the path of academic balance, the creative pursuit of science, while advancing, conserving, and restoring a direct experience of the deeper connection to all of life. It's part of our mission to expand our own experiential research with the multidisciplinary understanding that's available to us today. And so, as an educational institution, we take an open approach and we invite scholars in related fields to help present their work, help broaden the scope of our own work and exploration. And that's why we call this conversation for exploration. You're invited to check out our website. We have hundreds of on-demand videos and podcasts, webcasts, all available to you, all available at cuyamagainstitute.com. So today, we want to get down to the bare bones of forensic anthropology. You can see what I did there, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Our guest, a forensic anthropologist, will share stories and insights from her cases, using forensic tools to reveal what's hidden from us at first glance. Bones offer an amazing clue to the trained eye. A trained forensic anthropologist, using techniques also favored by archeologists, can identify gender, ethnicity, age, illnesses, pregnancies, even possible careers. And recently, research has extended forensic sciences to reach from the present world we live in into prehistory. So now something rather special is happening. Using the tools of forensic science, we can unlock more and more of the mysteries of human evolution.
Well, indeed, Paul, one of our first introductions to forensic anthropology was when we were visiting our friend Gwen Spencer
Oh, yeah.
in Cortez, Colorado, in a 100-year-old farmhouse. And we walked into Gwen's house and her living room, where there was this giant, ancient old oak table. And on the table was carefully laid out this whole array of old bones.
Yeah.
And Cindy Bradley, wife of Bruce Bradley, both of them anthropologists and archaeologists, they
Croquet.
were working on a project through Crow Canyon, where some Pueblo elders had asked them, please decode these bones, read these bones from our ancestors, help tell us their story. And Cindy sat down with us so kindly, and she just was picking up bones and showing us what she could read on them.
Yeah.
It was like a book, and she described it as reading a book. Lifestyle and trauma and injuries and nutrition and just everything right there
The
to
skull,
read.
the skull modification stuff.
She showed us tiny skulls that had a flat part in the back. She just sort of cradle boarding and described that. And this was so intriguing. So as we went to the Anthropology of Consciousness conference, which was a wonderful event,
A month ago.
we met Stephanie Fox. And here she is, a forensic anthropologist. And we're like immediately intrigued. Stephanie, can you join us and tell us more about your field and what you can do to read bones, to read evidence? For us, it's all about seeing further and farther into our life. We do this through inner technology, see further, farther, open our bandwidth. And this is another aspect of what humankind has done to invent tools and methodologies and instrumentation and deductive databases, all of these tools to read a story. Stephanie is also a mythologist. And so it's really all about telling a story, which we want to do as well. What is the story here of evidence that you need to bring out special tools and to tell a story? Stephanie, you've taught anthropology, you've taught forensic anthropology, you've worked on the law enforcement and a coroner's department for 10 years. You've got this fascinating story, so we're delighted to welcome you to help share from your field work, from your case files, from your insights. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
She's also on the board of the Anthropology of Consciousness committees. And so, yeah. And so I think the next conference you're going to oversee is Magic and Mysteries, Ancient Mysteries. So you've got a lot of stories to tell. So welcome back. She joins us from Bellingham, Washington. So first of all, how did you get into the field? Why anthropology? Why forensic anthropology? I know there's many specialties in anthropology.
Yeah,
Because
well,
we humans are a fascinating species to look at, aren't we? Yeah.
yeah. Well, anthropology is really a huge group of wonderfully interconnected disciplines. But I sort of fell in love with anthropology. I was a theater major of all things, and I fell in love with anthropology as an undergrad, and immediately switched majors and went into that, and that was great. When it came time to go into a master's program, I had applied, I was accepted into UNLV, and I was actually more into the consciousness aspect of it. I was looking at medical anthropology, looking at does medicine, Western medicine need a shaman, that sort of things. And then I was on watching some documentary, and they had found what they believed to be Jesse James's remains. And so I just watching this documentary and seeing what they were doing with the skeleton, I said, okay, that's it. That's what I have to go do. So once I got into the department at UNLV, I went into my advisor, said, I'm going to switch. And which made him much happier too, because he was very much interested in more of that stuff anyway. So
You're off and running. And were those bones from Jesse James?
I believe they were. I don't really remember what the documentary was at this point, but yeah.
So, what is define forensic anthropology, if you would?
So forensic in and of itself is about argument. Ultimately, it's about you're going to court and you're going to argue something and use all of the evidence that you've accumulated to make your point. So for anthropology, it is in this legal sense of we're going out to look at remains and determine who that person was, what they were doing, what's happened to them. That's the whole puzzle aspect, which of course is something that really drew me to all of this as well. So yeah, you're going out there and finding all those things. So ultimately, you can have a resolution in court as to, because most of the time these kinds of victims it's a result of some sort of criminal activity.
Right.
And it can be applied from on the small level at a local agency. You found a human and you have to figure out what's done to it, and to a huge level of looking at war crimes and genocides and things like that. So it has a very large application in the legal sense.
Or a historical person, or even something from prehistory.
Yeah.
Applied. Also, I think that wildlife, for example, if there's poaching and there's some bones, can you read those? Or what happened to the beached whales on a coastline? What happened to them? So I think there's a lot of applications.
Outside of the human, yeah.
Yeah, as well.
Yeah.
So what has been the range of cases that you've worked on?
Oh, well, so not only was I a forensic anthropologist, I did crime scene. I was a crime scene analyst as well for those departments.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I've seen a lot, everything from the very mundane burglaries to actual, pretty gruesome, grisly homicides and things like that.
How do you stomach that personally? How does it affect you emotionally?
Well, I feel like there are people that are okay with that just sort of have whatever it takes in them to be able to go see those things. I feel like I was one of those kinds of people. I hated horror movies as a kid, which is kind of weird. My mother was a trauma nurse. She was a flight nurse, and she'd show me pictures of things. And well, she didn't show them to me. I sort of snuck looks at them, and then she had to deal with the aftermath, because I was like, this is awful. These are horrible things to see, and hated horror films. So I'm really surprised that it turns out I'm okay with it. After, going through the program, I was an intern at the coroner's office, and that was kind of my introduction to actually seeing more than just bones, because bones, when you look at them, and they're nice and clean, it's really quite cool. But you go into the morgue and you see the more grisly aspect of it. You see bones that have a lot of tissue on them and stuff like that. Yeah, and I saw my first autopsy and I was hooked. I was like, this is so fascinating. Just the actual elements of of the human body itself. It's just fascinating how it all worked. It was just, it's amazing to me. And then the whole puzzle aspect of the mystery that's involved with some victim, yeah, you know, how do I solve this? So I think my analytical mind sort of took over those things.
Mhm.
And I didn't really get to any kind of emotional stuff really until you start, you know, dealing with victims' families and their
Oh,
emotional, then that's when it hits you really for me.
yeah, I
It
bet.
was
Yeah.
their
That makes
pain
sense.
because this individual's gone and no longer in pain in that sense. So yeah, I feel like some people just have an aptitude for it and some people don't.
You've just explained the popularity of all those CSI shows
Yeah.
on television. And yeah, so are those true to life, those depictions? I mean, they
Um,
have to change it up and make it like fit into a
yeah.
certain, yeah.
Storyline.
Yeah, you need to make it more interesting. I used to get emails for the creators of the TV show Bones because they'd ask me sort of questions about
Oh,
bodies and stuff, and you know I always felt bad, and maybe they stopped emailing me at some point because I'm like, well, you know, we don't deal with that part. The some of the, you know, this puzzle part we deal with, but a lot of the things that they're dealing with outside of that is outside of the realm of what I would do. I don't interview people. I don't talk to people. I
Yeah.
you know.
but they're helping
Um,
tell a storyline. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, you know, you have to make it more interesting. When the crime scene show, the CSI came out, we had to start when we'd go to court to testify. Again, the forensic aspect of it, you know, the debate. We would have to explain that that's television and this is real life. And no, we can't do all of the things exactly like, you know, they use the techniques and the technology and that sort of stuff, but there are elements to make it fit into your hour
Mhm.
and
Right.
make it interesting and make it a good story. So yeah, it comes from kernels of truth, and there are a lot of things that really do happen. But yeah, there's a lot of Hollywood too in this.
But you're also interested in story. You're also a mythologist.
Yes,
So is that also what intrigues you in terms of the detective story that you're telling is you want to know the story and you want
yeah,
to, yeah,
yeah.
build that out. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I want to know what happened. I want to know why. I want these things to be explained to me and told to me, and I want to hear this person explain to me what happened to you and what do you know what can I do to make it right.
Bring
Mhm.
justice to some of this.
Yeah.
What are the range of tools that you use?
Oh, well, you know, it's hard. It's there's so much now with our technologies and stuff. But
Yeah.
was starting when I first started in the forensic stuff, it was all kind of just by eye. We would just take what we had and look at it and come up with things. And now there's so much data. We have so many things you can use, you know, with measurements and put them into programs, and the programs will tell you things that you need to know. DNA in it is an
Oh,
amazing technique now we have, especially
yeah.
now that we've got so much more that when we have somebody and we're trying to say what this person might be to get information out there,
Yeah.
we can even look at, well, potentially they have this skin shade and this hair type and those sorts of things, which really help in identifying somebody's,
Yeah.
you know, missing person to these remains.
Yeah.
So even the tiniest speck of the DNA, it seems, can be useful now. It's not just swabbing, or you get to get recent DNA, but I was watching a PBS documentary, and they were talking about an anthropologist who was looking at DNA on the ground to understand, even in the frozen tundra, how well it's preserved. Just animals living, dropping their DNA everywhere. Um,
Yeah.
and so you could tell what the flora and fauna was, the pollen, the this, it's lasting. And tiny specks now can be decoded. They don't need 10 strands, or 10 units. They have tiny pieces. So I'm thinking, wow, we're just discarding DNA all over the place. How do you collect that from the field? What can you do with that? How expensive is it to run all that? Um,
Well, you know, it's expensive and it's a bit time consuming. It's also outside of my purview, but the
yeah.
collecting of it, you know, it's just off of anything. You can once you find it, it's of evidence, and you think that it might be important in some way, and then you
Mhm.
can swab things. You can
Yeah.
you know take little pieces of it. whatever it is that you
What
need.
kind of budget do police departments have when they go out and investigate a scene? I mean, do you have to say, I've got this much I can spend on these kinds of tests? So do bigger cases get a bigger budget? How much can you do?
How's it
Well,
allocated?
Yeah.
Yeah, again,
How is it allocated? Yeah.
it really does depend on the case itself. Yeah, so lesser cases, they don't get the priority. So you have whatever your budget is, and you do as much within that that you can do. So
Yeah.
yeah, it just sort of depends on the severity of the crime, what's happening, those sorts of things. Again, kind of outside. I was nowhere near any money, so.
What, so the range of tools that you have, and then what's the most surprising cases? What were the ones that really either you couldn't solve or was just such a surprising result or really turned a case around? What?
Well, we had one case in the police department I worked at in the 1980s. They had found a young woman just in the desert. And so she was pretty, obviously she'd only been dead for a couple of days. They took her in for an autopsy. They took pictures of her, tried to get information out to find who this girl was. So there's no scene, there's no, just nothing but this poor victim. And it went unsolved, and then we actually exhumed her, hoping to get some DNA so that we could start doing DNA stuff. So, because in the 80s, we weren't taking that sort of stuff as much. So we exhumed her, and I was able to do this full workup on this skeleton from this exhumation. And then again, nothing happened for a very long time. And it wasn't until I moved out of Nevada up here into Washington that one of my coworkers, she's like, we found her. We found who she was. And she had finally been identified 40 some odd years later. So,
Wow.
not necessarily so much, it's surprising that we actually found this person. It's amazing how many missing persons they don't ever get connected to remains that you find. And that's very, very frustrating.
Oh, yeah. And for the families as well, there's no closure.
There's no closure, nothing to be
Yeah.
done for that. Yeah. And in Nevada, the Clark County Coroner's Office there for Las Vegas, they ended up starting a national website where they would put pictures up. And then it sort of got taken over by some other agencies, so that we're expanding so that it's more of a national database as opposed to local things, because all these little local agencies,
Mhm.
they're not able to get information to each other very easily. You don't know where it turns out this girl, I believe she was from New Mexico. So, not too far away, but far enough away that there's nothing for us to connect this two. So, I mean, it's a wonderful thing, and hopefully that more and more of that can, as we get in more and more national interest in that, we can help finish these cases, get some closure.
And all those, I have friends in Canada who are talking about all the mass graves from schools where Native children were forced and sent and not well cared for, and that they're doing forensics to try to identify them. I mean, cases like that must wrench your heart. Yeah.
Yeah, that's along the lines with those genocides and the war crimes and things like that.
Yeah.
And it's
But
somebody wants to be famous.
we have tools that,
Tail time.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then and then this interesting story that pops up about the handprints on cave walls.
Oh, yeah, I was reading this article.
Interesting. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I was reading this article just in preparation for today's conversation. And of course, it caught my attention, just the very title of it, how forensic science can unlock the mysteries of human evolution.
Yeah.
And it goes right into the analysis of the cave walls and the fingerprints, and saying that you can't just determine whether it's male or female by length of fingers or size of hands, that they go into another whole level of analysis. And there's also that missing digit aspect that you
Yeah.
were talking about too.
Were they folding their fingers down? Were they missing joints? What is that about?
What does it mean? Yeah.
How does forensic anthropology go about even decoding that? What are some of the tools that you use to determine, oh, this is a female hand, not a teenager hand, just because it's smaller
Yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah, well, you have to know, I mean, we have a lot of information from, we can do a lot with length of bones throughout the body. And of course, the smaller your bones get, big from nice big long ones to the smaller ones, the more difficult it is. The other aspect of that is that you have to understand the population that you're dealing with.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's variation between populations that can affect those sorts of sizes and things like that. And I know one of the other things they were looking at were fingerprints, because a lot of them leave fingerprints and things like that. And, you know, you can't really determine that from gender or sex from fingerprints necessarily either. So that's kind of contentious, but it's
Yeah.
something that they're also using for that. So it's all
But
very
are there-
interesting, and I don't know a lot about it, but
But are there algorithms when you collect enough population and genetics and lineage
yeah,
that?
once you get enough data
Mhm.
from known things, then you can start using all the math, all the wonderful math, because you have to know math to do all that kind of stuff.
So you have a lot of databases, you connect the databases now, and now you can use AI, for example, to crunch through it and give you probabilities. I mean, there will always be outliers, but probabilities and then there's a lot that these general trends can tell you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know Todd Van Poel is going to have a lot to say about that, because that's one of the things that he works with.
Yeah.
Yeah, statistical analysis and all of that. Where would you like to go with forensic anthropology? What are some of the intriguing questions about humanity and our history or our ecosystem that you would like to see your tools, your expertise applied to?
It's an
What would
interesting
be your dream
combination.
assignment?
Yeah, an interesting combination of your aspect of mythology in your life and how you've taught that, along with something so specific as what forensic sciences offer us. And so being able to have that that perspective as a mythologist, and then look at the bare bones, as we have put it already, the bare bones.
Metaphorically as
yeah,
well.
yeah.
Yeah. I don't really know. I haven't really thought about, where to take it and where it should go. I really haven't given that much thought. So I don't know. I don't really know how to answer that. At one point, I sort of thought with DNA that maybe it would be something that wasn't as useful anymore.
Hmm.
Just looking at skeletal remains and figuring it out by eye, because now we have this wonderful tool. But I kind of have relaxed on that, and I feel like, no, there's still a place for it, and it's still an important thing to look at. And obviously, as we go out into, if we ever do go further out into space, we're going back to the moon, we're going, people are talking about wanting to go to Mars and stuff. What would those kinds of environments do to us? That's kind of an interesting
Yeah.
Oh,
thing
that's
to
a very
think of
intriguing
way down the road. But yeah, because of those things will have an effect on what our biology is, and what will that do to us? So
Yeah.
Right, because we're interacting with each environment, and
Yeah.
there's a two-way street
Yeah.
going on.
And the lack of gravity on the
Lack of
bones and all
gravity.
that
Yeah.
would shift everything as well. Yeah.
Well, I also want to say that we're remodeling our bones all the time. If you can read the bones and a story and all of that, we're remodeling our bones. And so what effect do we have? I mean, what are we going to leave for future anthropologists to look at? And how is everything that we do, our lifestyle, our nutrition, our activities, our physical environment, how is that impacting us?
Yeah.
So this is, I think there's a lot to apply for health and nutrition as well. I'm sure that that's going on,
And
and
I could,
lifestyle choices.
Oh,
and to
yeah.
add to that, we have this idea that somehow digital information will always be available. There's no guarantees that all the documentation we're doing digitally will always make it into the future, but the bones will still be there. If
Interesting.
the physical aspects, the
And
stories
the
may
teeth
the
and-
stories may come back to the bones again if this technology ever wipes itself out in the
Mhm.
far future or
So
something.
you're imagining future anthropologists in the
Starting over.
distant coming back and looking, oh, look at this
Yeah.
era, what they did. We
Yeah.
can read something
Yeah.
about them.
What's that?
Yeah.
What's that thing in his hand? Oh my.
Yeah.
Oh my God,
No,
how did you
anyway.
change your hand holding that
What
screen
a-
for so many hours?
Anyway.
Tony's got a question.
Oh, Tony said, Tony, go ahead.
Just put him on.
Turn your
Yeah.
mic.
Okay, well, I was intrigued about the woman from New
Oh,
Mexico. What is her story? Do you know? Can you fill in a little bit of more beyond the bones of the story?
yeah. Well, oh, I can tell you all I know. She was a runaway. So she was a teenage girl. I think she was 17. She was a runaway, and she had been last seen at a truck stop, getting into something and leaving New Mexico with in this unknown vehicle. Really, that's kind of it. That's all I know. So just that tragedy of what happens to some runaways, sort of
Mhm.
cautionary tale and stuff. But she did have a sister still alive, that now has some closure as to what happened to her. Not a
Well,
lot of
thank you.
information, but
No,
The
but
story.
that is quite a bit, and I appreciate that. I was wondering, so thank you.
yeah,
Tony, you're mentioning metrics and protocols for astronauts
yeah.
to deal with these very things, how the environment impacts us.
We'll go on space station in zero gravity for a protracted length of time, and there are things they do with isometric exercise and stuff like that to otherwise bone density would disappear.
Mhm.
So there's, you know, a colleague of mine at JPL which does most of the Mars programs, does all the Mars programs for the US, uh, is very concerned when people start talking about colonizing Mars, and talks about how long one could be on Mars without doing extraordinary isometric things to the point where you never could return to Earth because your skeletal structure would no longer stand up under the much higher gravity that we have.
Sure.
And the same for placing people on the moon. I mean, yes, you have to do isometric type of things, but it's not living like we live on Earth. You have to do a lot to keep your bone density and your skeletal strength. I don't know if you've looked into this at all. There is a literature of it, and I know that would be kind of skewed to what you're talking about, but I thought I would simply mention, since you mentioned
Yeah, yeah.
Mars, that this is something that is worried about.
Yeah.
So all the technocrats that are talking about, oh, let's just leave planet Earth, let's just go colonize the next planets over. Not such an easy job, is it? Not so doable.
Yeah.
Why not fix this planet first? Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So
yeah. We
Yeah.
were made
Little
for
things,
this planet.
little things,
thank
yeah,
you.
little things
Yeah,
are
we
so
were-
important, like the tides and what is the effect of tides on the evolution of life, and the gravitational field. I mean, if somebody had lived on a planet with 1/10 the gravitational field, they would look very different than we did, or 10 times the gravitational field. They would look very different, and I'm sure
Yeah.
Stephanie could with a few minutes of calculation estimate what these people would look like.
Mm.
Mm.
Mhm.
Well, it's interesting. If we ever meet alien species, they're going to be as adapted to their natural environment as we are to ours. And so you can, I mean, sci-fi should be talking to you too, Stephanie. Like, what would this look like? You have some exoplanets in mind to make your sci-fi around, and what would the aliens, how would they adapt, right?
Yeah.
What would support intelligent life? Some intriguing questions.
Yeah.
Use the science.
Yeah. Thank you, Tony.
So,
Yeah.
oh, wow.
All right.
Can we talk to Todd also, who deals with the same kind of forensics?
In a different way, but yes. So
Todd, this is very akin to your field as well, and what you've been doing in some aspects archaeologically.
Finally got my mute off. Yeah, I deal with archaeology, but I have to admit that in terms of the squeamishness factor, I tend to stay away from human bodies as much as possible, especially the fresh ones. And so, Stephanie, I applaud you for having the stomach to deal with that. But uh, bones are one of those things that I tend to leave to my good friend Gordon Makita, who's a specialist in the area. And so whenever when we're out doing archaeological excavations, that's kind of his job. However, one of the things I find really interesting about what you do, Stephanie, that I think is very cool, is you blend the kind of the scientific approaches with the sorts of humanistic approaches that are characteristic of organizations like the Anthropology of Consciousness,
right.
where a lot of the Anthropology of Consciousness is focused on kind of experiential events and social meaning, cultural meaning, kind of some aspects that go beyond just simply the bodies themselves in terms of a measurement or whatnot. And I think it's cool how you're able to blend those together. And so, in terms of a question, I'd love to hear you comment or talk about cases where you've seen a place where you can see something about culture or experiences or something that's of kind of that anthropology of consciousness sort of
Right.
interest through the bones that you've been working with?
Yeah.
Good one, Todd.
It's a good one. I don't, as far as the anthropology of consciousness itself, can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I do have one that's kind of culturally relevant. In that when I was first at the coroner's office as an intern, they had found the remains of a young person, so it was a juvenile. And of course, juveniles, because their bones aren't fully formed, create a whole another host of problems that you have to deal with. So I took this skeleton and I got out my juvenile osteology book, which is about that thick, and I figured out that it was probably somebody that was 15, and just based on how the fusion was going together, it was probably male, which totally upset the apple cart because it was wearing a skirt. So this actually leads to notions of gender versus sex. These are two different things. They shouldn't be conflated. They are absolutely separate. And they, of course, here's this young woman, kind of intern person. What does she know? So they ended up sending it to the Smithsonian. They came up with the exact same thing as I did. And of course, the detectives didn't want to hear that because that just opens it up to everybody as opposed to just, potentially 50% of the population. And turns out they did finally identify this individual. What the parents said was, well, sometimes he wears his sister's clothes because his clothes are dirty. And, this was in the 90s. So it's one of those things about, is this a gender identity? And what does that do? Because I can't tell you what their gender identity is. I can only tell you what their biological sex is. So you have to remain open to the possibility that this person has a different gender identity. It's totally defined by culture, So yeah, those aspects that make the forensic part of it very, very difficult when the biology and the math and the data all gives you this thing. Well, there's culture, and that gives you a whole nother suite of issues that you're going to have to deal with. And it does make things in an investigative sense much more complicated.
One of the frequent storylines that you have in film and is that the police force just wants answers. They just want to pin a crime on somebody, and they just want a story. They don't want any kind of conundrums like that to make their work harder. Do you actually find that? You're married to someone in law enforcement. You hear about this. You've worked with police departments. Is that just a false premise, or do you see that in the field?
No, they really do they just want to figure it out, and they want to figure it out as quickly as they can. Right. And that leads to we're gonna work this crime scene. It's 1 o'clock in the morning and it's pitch black. Can't we wait till the sun comes up? Because that light is better than any flashlight or any group, So yeah, then from that point on, yes, they don't want it to be more difficult. They're not just trying, the one part I do have issue with is they're not just trying to pin it on somebody. They want to get the right person. They really do. And they want to rule out anybody that they can rule out. But yeah, they do want to get it done. So.
The other question is, well, how often have you overturned somebody being accused and kind of saved them because the evidence suggests it's not them? So how have you undone? Yeah.
Well, I think for a lot of what we do, it's right at the beginning. You see that sort of stuff. It's like, oh, we've got new evidence, and it gets people out. For me, with the forensic stuff, and we're going to rule those people out off the bat if we potentially can. So, I don't have a lot of closure with a lot of my cases. A lot of things don't go to court, or they've gone to court without me. So I don't ever really know how a lot of them end. So I don't have the figures for that. But yeah, that is when going in for crime scene specifically, our job is we want the evidence that shows this person is fine, this person is likely somebody to look at. That's part of our goal, is to rule out who we can and to figure out who did whatever it is they did.
You've likened your forensics of a current dig, so to speak, to an archaeological dig. So you have Chris and Todd right here who specialize in archaeological digs. Let's have a dialogue about how those tools compare.
Yeah, yeah. I'm coming back to Todd's question a little bit about the anthropology of consciousness and how that aspect and that relationship to your work, because ultimately, it's definitely a much broader perspective of approach. And it sounds like you have, you had mentioned in the very beginning that that's one of your driving interests is the study of consciousness itself as well.
Yeah. Well, as far as what I do for the digs and things like that, it is taking all of those things that archaeologists do
Yeah.
and crunching it down into a much shorter time frame.
Mhm.
So we don't get to, again, with the police want to get it done. We want this scene finished and out of here as quickly as we possibly can, without doing the best job that we can while we do that. But yeah, so it's much more condensed. It's doing what might take weeks for an archaeologist. We'll do it in hours.
Mhm.
Because
Go ahead.
One of the big differences, I think, is a lot of times there are different scales of questions. And so while I don't head these projects, we've had it through the University of Missouri a couple of times where we help the police in projects. One case was there was a house fire and it burned. There were some cats in the house. There was also most likely a human in the house, and they had some bones, and they didn't know whether they were just cat bones. They didn't know if there were perhaps, I don't know, raccoons up in the attic or something, or if these were human bones. And they weren't also getting them in the bones they'd recovered weren't from actually in the house. So the University of Missouri did an excavation, and the focus was literally only to get enough bones to either to confirm that there was a human in the house or not, so that they could proceed with the right sort of investigation, and they could issue a certificate of death and these sorts of things. And so as soon as they found something that was identifiably a human bone, it was done. And for an archaeologist, that would not be where we would end. It would that would just be a part of it. And so one of the big differences here is kind of on the scale of the information you're going for. And Stephanie, I'm sure you can talk more to this, but it's a different sort of a question in the terms of trying to create a more complete sort of holistic picture of what happened, say, with the fire versus is there a human inside this house or not?
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. It's like looking at life ways. We're trying to go for a whole life way versus this one person's life. So yeah, the questions are very, very different. It's who is it and why is it here being, what happened to it to get this person in this position. So yeah.
have you ever had
question.
occasion, Todd, to call in a forensic anthropologist in any of the digs? Does that happen? Do the fields cross?
So working with human materials in the archaeological record is really quite different, I think, from the sorts of crime scene investigation that Stephanie does. So when we are out doing excavations, say in southern New Mexico, when we did this, we actually went by the sheriff's department and we said, hey, we're going to be out here, we're going to be excavating. We might encounter some human materials. We've got this permit that allows us to uncover them, but we're not going to collect them and all those sorts of things. And then we asked them, do you want us to call you or to investigate or not? And their response was, I think, a very reasonable one. Hey, if it looks like it's recent, then yes, call us. And if it looks like it's what you're expecting with the archaeological record, then don't, there's no reason for us to do an investigation.
Right.
I just want to add that for the type of research we do in most North American archaeologists, we're underneath NAGPRA regulations, Native American Graves Repatriation Act.
Yeah.
There are a lot of things we cannot do and can do, but it's always with tribal consultation. So we're very careful, and our permits require that we have tribal approval and consultation. So it's a whole different process, I think, on that front for what we do. We also ask big questions about things like culture, religion, religious practices, what people were eating in the past. We can ask a whole lot of questions without actually having to remove a human out of the ground. So often we just end up saying, yep, that looks like respectfully say, yes, I think that is in context as it needs to be, the person, and then we cover it up, and then we open another unit somewhere else on the site.
Mm.
But you're not just looking at bones, you're looking at a whole site and its mythology, its iconography, its artifacts, pottery, symbols, layout of the buildings. how they're oriented, how they were built. I mean, where's the water? How does it go? How is it handled? You're telling a story of a whole culture. So,
Absolutely. At our excavations down in southern New Mexico, we recovered, I'm going to guess conservatively, 50,000 bits of pottery, and probably comparable to over 100,000. Chris corrected me, and an equal number of bits of stone, flakes and whatnot. And we ran into one formal burial, which we, as Chris just described, we investigated enough to make sure it was a burial. We recorded the portions that we had excavated and exposed, and then we simply reburied it and moved over to another excavation unit so as not to disturb that burial. And so this is, of course, very different from the sort of work that Stephanie does, where she's looking at the body primarily as a source of information. Anthropologists can do wonderful, incredible things in terms of getting information from human remains, but that's one of those areas where you have to be a real specialist. What Stephanie does takes a lifetime worth of work and training to be able to master it. And so, I'm really good with stone artifacts. You give me an assemblage of stone and I can tell you a lot about it. You give me, parts of a human body and I'll be able to tell you, yeah, it's part of a human body, but that's about as much as I'm going to be able to tell you. Whereas Stephanie can probably tell you all sorts of different things about load bearing and potentially cause of death and age and sex and a whole bunch of other stuff that for me, it's like, yeah, that looks like a skull. Whereas Stephanie can tell you a great deal about it.
I can identify that skull in your case.
Yeah.
Skull.
Yeah.
Happy reproduction, I'm thinking, but yeah.
Yeah, all of ours came from Party Central in our Halloween decorations. We don't have any good
I
ones.
have some of those.
And they actually don't even look right, so you can tell they're frauds from the get-go.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
You too.
Nice
Great.
to be a specialist.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting that bring the two fields in and tell the story even fuller.
Yeah.
And I guess that's why Cindy Bradley had the Pueblo people asking her. She was working directly with them
Mhm.
about this is the story there. And also Bruce, her husband, they took us out to Crow Canyon and they were showing us sites that they had excavated in like a burned down kiva
Mhm.
because there was peaceful community, but warfare at one point. And he was telling the story of even the building, the timbers, how it fell. They even found little clay artifacts. And he was saying now, these weren't intentionally fired, but they became fired when the building burned. These were, and then he had to go ask, he was saying the Pueblo elders that they were working with, what are these about? And they said, oh, when we sit around with long ceremonies, we're picking up pieces of clay, just something to do with our hands, just to occupy ourselves as we're going through these long ceremonies.
Yeah.
And they became fired. So it's interesting, all the techniques that come to bear to tell a story of a culture and what happened at
Mhm.
that moment when it was preserved in time. It's just like fascinating. I remember talking to a pilot and he was telling me about reading the clouds. I look at a sky and I see clouds. He looks at a sky and he sees pathways. He sees currents. He sees velocity. He sees pressure, air pressure pockets.
Mhm.
Like, it's just fascinating to open up your eyes through your various expertise and see how people around us are decoding things that I don't see until you tell me all about it.
Right.
It's like fascinating, eye-opening.
Yeah.
So,
Well, thank you, Todd. Yeah, you always.
anything more that you all want to add to this?
No.
Yeah.
Chris, did you have
You
more?
always have good stories.
She said thumbs up.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
Wow.
whoops, there we go. Oh,
And, Tony, I can just imagine in the search for planets around other suns and exoplanets, how those stories are going to be told as well, and the tools that we'll have in the future to help tell them.
Yeah.
So,
It's interesting that when I started doing exoplanets around the year 2000, I would go to conferences and there just began to be astrobiology. And there would be a conference and maybe a dozen people would be there. Now I go to a conference and there are hundreds of people sitting in the lecture room with multiple sessions talking about astrobiology.
Mm.
And so, yes, there is a connection.
yeah.
Oh, fabulous. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, you looking to look at the comment? Oh, Tony,
Yeah.
that was the comment Tony made earlier. Yeah. Well, and again, it comes back to, for me, it comes back to like this article talks about, which it's part of what we research here at this institute and want to be connected to, and is understanding this connection to how the sciences can unlock the mystery of human evolution, looking at those details that we're finding and what that connection can be. This is an area that we of course are looking at the human body from the position of posture and why sculptures and designs and artifacts are done a certain way. But this idea of being able to get down to the basics of the human anatomy and why it was there and what they did. And the cave walls telling a story just from the handprint is something that I just find fascinating as well.
Who
So,
was there and
yeah.
why?
yeah.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Anything else you want to share with us, Stephanie?
Well, that talking about what Todd was talking about with the going to the sheriff's office and stuff. Basically, we're dealing with the last 50 years.
Mhm.
If it's older than 50 years, probably all of the parties that are involved in whatever crime happened, it's not going to, it's not going to matter anymore because they won't be around. So I actually did a case. There's a young man he liked to go try and find arrowheads in this particular desert area at the north side of Las Vegas. And he was sort of moving away some dirt and uncovered a skull. So he quickly covered it up and put a stick in to mark the spot and called the police department. So, we get it from the other end sometimes. So that we go out. They called me to come. It was a different jurisdiction. They called me to come out to see if it was something of forensic value. So I had crime scene technicians and all sorts of people helped me excavate. It was a full-on skeleton in fetal position. I looked at her teeth. She was clearly historic. So then we called the school. We called the local Paiute tribe that was in charge of that area.
Mhm.
The school wasn't interested, archaeologically speaking, and the tribe said that they would take it if we could get the skeleton out. So I excavated it for the tribe, and then we turned it over to the tribe, and they actually had her date tested, and she was 1,600 years old. So opposite end in the police capacity, actually helping with some archaeological kind of stuff.
Oh, wow.
Because the huge controversy story that we were covering at the time back in the world of journalism.
Oh, yeah.
Was Kennewick Man. When Kennewick Man was found on the coast of the Columbia River there, because that was a huge debate and everything was swirling around it, and it was pulled from both sides, from the tribal and from the it was
Jim Chowders, we had him.
we
talk with
as it
him.
happened. I think that whole story, Christine knows the real story now, how
Yeah.
it all finalized, but at the time it was
The Druids were coming in, claiming it.
it was a druid. No,
Yeah.
it was
So
yeah.
what ancestry was he? It was just a huge
And now that I
story.
brought it up, Christine, what was the
I
final?
rarely covered current events, but that was one that was a sign.
Yeah, no, it was finally returned because they did DNA testing on.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I use that one a lot when I'm teaching forensic stuff because it's a
A famous case.
Yeah.
it's a very famous case. It was the way the remains were handled in the beginning. The fact that we lost bones and things like that, it's very disturbing from an ethical standpoint.
Right.
Whether it's the coroner's office or somewhere else along the way, it was very disturbing to have to deal with those sorts of things. So
In the midst of the whole debate, wasn't the whole thing bulldozed or something? I said, wait a minute, what are you doing that for?
yeah, the
Corps of Engineers came in and just
Yeah.
covered it up.
traveled over the site.
What?
I never understood why that would be. And Chris, if you have any
Yeah, I'll bring
insight
Chris
on
on.
this.
This is Chris's.
Oh my gosh, why would they do that? Why would they not want to find anything else? And who authorized that?
The Corps of Engineers were working with the Umatilla, and they were working with the whole issue. And then it's a really there are so many tragic things with Kennewick Man, but ended up being a legal battle against anthropologists as well. So you had the Smithsonian anthropologists arguing with other anthropologists like James Chatter and the different positions on that. You had people that wanted to 100% turn it over to Umatilla from the get-go, but you also had the scientific archaeologists at the Smithsonian wanting to do it. The Corps of Engineers, I think there are a lot of things I don't know. We know aspects of the case because we ended up with Joe Powell at UNM, who was asked to be the mediator on the case at one point. And so he had all the x-rays from Kennewick Man. Most Native Americans call him the Ancient One. That's what they call them. That's what we've been asked to call. But yes, I think, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth for sure, but I know that the Corps of Engineers, I think, and working with the Umatilla, were trying to do things that they thought would be best for the tribal people up there. And so respectfully. So despite that, Douglas Owsley at the Smithsonian had other soil scientists go in there, and they did a pretty good job reconstructing what the burial site would have looked like, how his head was facing upstream, and a whole bunch of other really interesting things as well. And the amount of data that the scientists pulled from Kennewick Man from a scientific perspective is really astounding, just astounding. I'm sure Stephanie could say a lot more about that. But yeah, there's just so many. I mean, it was within the field of anthropology, conflicts going on, and then with Umatilla and the anthropologists going on, but we had people with the Umatilla, people not. It was really complex. Do you want to add anything, Todd? We were both at Calvary right after that happened.
This one of the interesting things is that there are different. Archaeology is a young science, and we're still growing. We're still developing methods and whatnot. One of the areas where we're developing some really cool and really useful methods is actually the sort of work that Stephanie does. And so our ability to do, for example, ancient DNA is increasing. 30 years ago, it was unheard of. 20 years ago, it was rare. 10 years ago, we were starting to figure it out. And now we're at a position where we can do all sorts of interesting things that we would not have even dreamed were possible 50 years ago or even 30 years ago. And then also looking at the bodies and being able to get information from the bones themselves. Our ability to get that information is increasing. It seems like daily. I'm always amazed at what our physical anthropology colleagues can do in terms of forensic analysis and lifeways reconstruction and some of these other things. So the sort of work that Stephanie is doing is greatly increasing our ability to get knowledge, and around the world, not just simply in North America, but around the world. Skeletal analyses are creating incredible insights into the past. But it is an ethical dilemma, especially in places like North America, where there's the cultural structure of the dead is not the same as is typical of kind of a lot of Western-based cultures and European-based cultures. And so I know that I think it was Oxford. I think it's Oxford. They have Jeremy Bentham stuffed and mummified and put on display
In his office.
and that seems kind of cool.
Okay.
If I was important enough that somebody would stuff me and mount me and put me on display, I think that'd be kind of an honor. But for many Native American groups, that would be
Horror.
terrible, terrible, terrible,
Yes.
the worst sort of thing you could possibly do. And so there's a lot of cultural variation here in terms of the way that we approach the dead in these different contexts. So just because we can get good information doesn't mean that we ought to get that good information. I'm sure that this is an issue that Stephanie deals with on a regular basis.
Yeah, well, the whole human remains that you can buy on the internet,
Really?
off of Instagram, there are legitimate outfits that sell human remains. You know, they're for teaching purposes. It's for that. It's not for novelty.
Okay.
But what I'm seeing is this sort of push here in the States, this sort of push that all dead people are sacred. So it's sort of taking that extreme position, and it's like, well, not every culture feels that way. You know, that's why we can have somebody stuffed in their thing, especially if that's what they were okay with.
Well, the
but
saints are
sort of-
honored when we take their bones and make relics of them, and people want to
Yes.
come and see them. Yeah. So,
Yeah, yeah, the Buddhist tradition of having relics, things like that. So yeah, there's definite, what I'm seeing is sort of this imposition of this notion that, oh well, all dead people should be, you know, should be put somewhere, buried somehow, you know, have that funeral thing and then never be thought of again. And I sort of sit on that going, well, that's okay, but that's also imposing your cultural values on somebody else's dead. And then for me, it's like I want to be able to have access to this so that I can maintain all of the data I need so that I can find some answers for somebody that's dead. Because if we cut off all of our information, we no longer have access to skeletal remains.
And their families want to know.
Yeah, I won't be able to have the whatever's changing in our populations. You know, that data is important stuff too. So it's kind of we're in a gray space that's kind of causing a lot of frustration.
To finish the Kennewick Man story, Chris and Todd and Stephanie, you've all studied it very deeply. How old was he? What is the story? What kinds of information do we know?
Go, Chris. She looks very ready.
The calibrated radiocarbon dating put him at 9,300 years old, plus or minus a couple hundred years.
Wow.
So about 9,000 years old.
And he had lived a pretty adventurous
Interesting.
life. He had a projectile point that was lodged, my recollection is, in his hip, and it had healed over, so it had hit him and been lodged there for a period of time before he passed away. And he had a number of broken bones that had healed. So he lived a very active life that included elements of danger for sure.
Stephanie, want anything? I teach fundamentals of archaeology, so that's one of the case studies that I cover. So I have long slides of him, but I'm happy to talk about that unless you want to talk about. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, go ahead. So one of the things that was most surprising in the world of science is we have this big game hunters that at the end during the Pleistocene, after the Pleistocene, this is right on the shift between the Pleistocene and the Holocene, that people were doing big game hunting. This person ate a lot of fish. Really incredibly healthy individual. The other thing that was fascinating is he spent a lot of time prolonged time in water and had a lot of ear damage. And it appears that he was probably doing deep sea fishing to get the fish to eat, which just shocked the community. He also has something called a flail chest, and Stephanie can talk about this more, but the ribs never went back into place, and so breathing would have been laborious. And if you think about a deep sea diver, you need to really take a deep breath, hold that, and then dive.
Yeah, they didn't have oxygen tanks 9,000 years ago.
Right, exactly. So you need the lungs, and people can do that worldwide that are do deep sea fishing. He also, when that arrow went into his hip, the bone started forming around it, but couldn't do that. And it was seeping probably throughout his life with a minor infection, but it healed enough that he ended up walking without a limp or a gait. It happened when he was a younger person. And so that's one of the things where it probably put him down for a while, and people would have had to care for him, take care of him. But then his muscle healed. And we know that through basically forensic, that type of work with physiology, where he was able to walk normal despite that. So he was also a very tough, strong human being that was able to take that at a lateral point into his hip, and then end up being able to walk normally, and then do deep sea fishing. He had shoulder damage, knee damage, ear damage. Yeah, and he also had a chunk in his head. He looked like he got hit on his head, so he had a chip out of his skull. We always say bones can talk, but man, if we could get him to talk a little bit more, the stories that Kennewick Man, the ancient one, would tell us would be pretty amazing, I would think.
Mm.
And what did DNA say about
So this was another one. I mean, this poor individual, with all the debates swirling around him. One of the earliest debates was, well, he's more like the Ainu, and the ancestry is closest way to the Ainu, which kind of makes sense because we know that people come from Asia down into the Americas during the Pleistocene. But subsequent DNA said, no, actually, he is most closely related to the Colville tribes up there in the Northwest. When that DNA evidence comes into play, that's when, if you will, the case gets put to bed, and the ancient one is laid to rest by representatives of, I think it's the 5 tribes of the Colville nation that were able to put him in an undisclosed location.
Yeah.
So definitely Native American, definitely related to, he had related descendants in the Colville reservation, the tribes up there.
Wow.
So when he went deep sea diving, he was what, going down the river to the coast and then diving off the coast
Well,
there, or
so there's a book on him. Actually, there's several books on Kennewick Man, but he was actually found much further inland than the ocean. And they hypothesize, and Stephanie can talk about isotopes,
Kennewick, Washington.
isotope analysis, but he was deep sea ocean diving, but then walked inland a long ways. And why he was inland, what he was doing, we don't really know. Some people hypothesize, well, maybe he's gathering rocks, really nice material or something like that. Something was going on that brought him into the inland, according to the Smithsonian
It's a
scientists.
beautiful thing about
Looks like
our
Stephanie was going to
early-
say something.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Well, I'm like, just, you know, just from what she's saying about all of the information that we were able to glean from him kind of shows why there was such a fervor, this debate as to whether we need to study him versus he needs to go back per the NAGPRA laws, basically.
Well, that was right at the start of NAGPRA. NAGPRA came in 1991. He's
Well,
found
yeah.
in 1996. And the other thing is, because of the way the laws get written, as Stephanie can talk to this, after he is found, major shifts in law, major shifts to accommodate these type of cases. But yeah, and that the problem with the 1991 law was cultural affiliation. You have to demonstrate the cultural affiliation of a person to a tribe. And with him being 9,000 years old, as it will turn out, what tribes does he belong to? The technology is nothing like the modern technology. So how do we match him to the right tribe? And now the NAGPRA law no longer says cultural affiliation. It's nearest neighbor, our nearest tribe now. And they shifted that for
That
this
makes
reason,
sense.
because it's so hard to do cultural affiliation with someone that old.
Yeah.
do they have any clues as to the lost bones? What bones were lost?
That's out of my purview.
Oh, yeah.
Both of his femora went missing for a time, and they actually found them in the coroner's office at some point, and they were redone. But I mean, yeah, when people were making claims, they were allowed to go in to see the remains, and I think that maybe it wasn't as they weren't watched as intently as they needed to be. Little bits and pieces probably went missing here and there, which to me is, I mean, you know, that sort of that sacred aspect is quite offensive.
Yeah.
It reminds me of Utsi, the 5,000-year-old
yeah.
Iceman found in the Alps. So there's a lot of comparison here. And he's got a fascinating story as well. But
Yeah.
here, Kennewick Man's twice as old almost.
That is
Yep.
amazing.
Like right at the end of the ice age, when big climate shifts are happening and a lot of migrations and opportunities. So it's interesting how far afield our ancestors got. I mean, they were travelers. They got around, didn't they? And a lot of trade going on and influence. So that's
Yeah.
exciting, especially around water, right? Because boats are a much easier transport system than just walking. They were utilized.
Yeah.
But have you both studied Utsi?
My students love Utsi, so we have to often talk about him too. And that's a fabulous find as a partially mummified human. Yeah, what about him would you like to ask?
The really interesting thing about Utsi for our students a lot of times is he has tattoos.
Yeah.
They always find the tattoos interesting. In fact, I think, Christine, was it you that had somebody who had Utsi's tattoos put on them?
So we had anthropologists are a fun and curious lot, but so his tattoos look a lot like a human from St. Lawrence Island up in the northern hemisphere, and the tattoos along the back and along the knees and along the calves are very much what we think of as medicinal tattoos. And a person actually went and did some cut and put red ochre in them to mimic them and see, were they really useful for helping with healing and healing tattoos. So right now, a lot of people think his tattoos, at least anthropologists, are for healing, because often spirits get into the body and cause harm and pain. But if you can put a tattoo over it, you can either guard a good spirit to stay in it, or you can ward off bad spirits out of a area with tattoos, which is really fascinating for Otzi. Yeah.
I hadn't heard that cultural connection, just that some of the tattoos are on meridian sites
Mhm.
where even tapping to do the tattoos. And
Yeah,
that's
there's a big
because-
debate about that. They just rolled over how they think those tattoos are done. They think it's a slice and dice type of thing instead of tapping. But that, of course, all this, when we get something that old, we get debates about how everything is.
What's a slice
done.
and dice technique for tattooing versus like pushing ink into the skin? What does
So
that
yeah,
mean?
one you're hitting and tapping, and doing another one, you're cutting it open and then putting the stuff in and leaving it there.
Ouch.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Wow, shows you how indelible those are. Also, he's found with a string of mushrooms, medicinal mushrooms. So that adds to that story as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, he was found, I forget with how many plants. I have it in my PowerPoint for my funnel. Yeah, 23 different plants. Todd talks about it too. His axe was fabulous. He has a missing body part too that just makes us worry and wonder about him. I don't know if I want to put that on camera, but
Ooh.
yeah, and that's a great case like Stephanie would have if it was here in the United States. They thought he was a homicide victim or a lost mountain climber, one or the other. And so they have the sheriff's department. Then that ended up in a boundary law issue. So you have two nations fighting about who he belongs to. Yeah, that's another case that got very complex with international law.
Well, and Stephanie can comment on the sort of information you can get from the soft tissue. So the nice thing about Utsi is that you have the whole body, not just simply the bones, but also things like the intestines that had preserved and allowed people to take a look and see what he had been eating and things like that. You can gain so much additional information from the soft tissue, where a lot of times archaeologists, for the most part, deal simply with the skeletal elements. But I'm sure Stephanie, at least on occasion, is dealing with the soft components as well, and you can gain so much
Yeah.
information.
Yeah.
Usually
And then
for-
the things with him are fascinating too, but I'll be quiet. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris
Thank you for
and
most
Todd.
of it.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
Yeah, the whole soft tissue thing is, so most often as an anthropologist, I would work with the coroner's office. And so the coroner would usually do whatever they wanted with the soft tissue, or the pathologist, the forensic pathologist would do the samples and stuff. And then I want it cleaned off, clean
I
it
see.
all off, have all of that removed, in order for me to do the best thing I can do with the bones. But yeah, you're right. There is so much that you can get from that. But in a forensic sense, then the pathologist will get to deal
But
with
you
it.
don't want the tissue and all that there. How do they quickly clean that down to the bones for you
Well-
then to study? And do they need, yeah,
Do you really want to know?
well, it's going to be
Yeah,
gruesome, I know.
that's probably the worst part of the whole thing is when you have a bunch of tissue. How do you get it off? Some tissue, it's enough. You can just, take a nice soft toothbrush and sort of scrub it off. Other times you might have to boil it down. And there's recipes for that involve different kinds of detergents, degreasers, and bleaches to sort of boil it down. But then if you do that, you're going to mess with other things. So if you need samples or DNA, you have to take that from somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
You
You
know,
leave that to other specialists, I'm sure.
Well, coming back just for a
Yeah.
moment to the Kennewick man, was this idea that we're finding more evidence of the history of this country, of this part of the world,
Migration,
the migrations that.
your
As
population.
as we were talking, I pulled up two articles on our website. One is the recent find of human remains in Oregon,
18,000
18,000
years.
years ago.
Yeah.
And so that's an article.
And the 21,000-year-old
The
footprint.
23,000-year-olds in
and
New Mexico. And this is Chris, I think, and Todd are more familiar with
Yeah.
this project. But I just, more and more evidence is coming forward of this type of thing, and then finding Kennewick man to be as old, 9,000 years old. All of a sudden, there's like, stop this whole idea that we're the,
Yeah.
a lot more was originating here than we ever have recognized before.
And that's such a fascinating story. Do you want to add to that? Because that's really where your fields come together, isn't it?
Mhm.
How do you read a footprint? I mean,
Yeah.
that's Yeah, that's like
That
reading-
was actually not done by archaeologists. That was done by a paleontologist. And that is something that archaeologists are still debating.
Okay.
I'm from near White Sands, New Mexico.
Yep.
And well, anyway, that's out of my purview. That's a geological proposition, the way I understand the article.
So a lot of times things get talked about before they're fully accepted. And that's one of those
Mhm.
cases where it's not that everybody's saying it's wrong. So it's
Right.
not to the point of, people saying it's
They're
a
saying
fraud.
prove it.
But people are saying we're still evaluating it. So to be perfectly honest, as Chris was saying, that's one of those things where we're not involved in the actual evaluation of those topics, and so we have no strong opinion. I will say this: I'm 100% certain that folks were here before we previously thought that they were. So
Yeah.
if we were having this conversation 30 years ago, I'd say, we don't really have any evidence of people being here before, say, 12,500 years ago. I'm 100% certain that we have people here much earlier than that. And so the idea that there is human materials from, say, 18,000 years ago, I'm entirely receptive to that claim. But of course, that claim has to be backed up by the appropriate analyses and appropriate evidence and all that stuff. And so I'm hopeful that we'll start to get more of these sites and be able to understand the past more fully. Those particular sites, I personally don't know enough about to say whether they're good or bad or indifferent. To my knowledge, they're still being evaluated.
Ah,
Yeah, that's my understanding. They're still being evaluated. The authorities on Clovis, the first major occupation of North America, they keep pushing the dates back. So they keep finding Clovis a little bit older, a little bit older. So I asked one of our colleagues who is the world-renowned specialist on it, Marcus Hamilton. He goes, I think pretty soon we're going to have Clovis back 13,500 years ago. And so they're slowly pushing them back. But
Yeah.
one of the things that our Paleo-Indian archaeologist buddies say is, how do you deal with the one unusual site? Is a fluke? Is there something going on with it? We can say for sure that when you get a high number of sites, a high number of projectile points, we can be certain that we do have a really early occupation. So it's really hard for archaeologists to deal with the one fluke or the one unique thing. And that would be some of our colleagues' discussion. So everyone, to my knowledge, now accepts Clovis as the first major occupation. And we're still grappling with what do you do when you have a mastodon with a mastodon point in it at 14,000. Well, is that good dating? Is that not good dating? And we get into those issues.
Yeah.
Mhm. And when were mastodons here? Right. All of that. It just seems to me those red flags are just indicators that, hey, there's new possibilities here. And when you amass all this evidence, for example, Clovis, why do you find it so widely spread? This particular way of napping as point. Doesn't that mean that the culture started way back with enough time to
Well, if they
Here's all
came
these sites.
over, if they
Yeah.
came over, or if they developed it here on the continent, that would be really hard. The other thing I know sounds terrible to say this, but the problem with the one-off or the occasional ones is how do you know it's not a fraud? How do you know it's not pelt down or something like that? And that
Yeah.
becomes the issue is how do you know the authenticity of that find? But when you have a whole bunch of them, then it's a lot easier to say, yeah, this is not a one case, somebody's pulling our leg or assaulted a site or something like that. But that's how it, but with Clovis, there's just so many of it, the evidence is overwhelming, and that's why we can accept that. But really only about 100 years ago, we didn't think that people had been on this continent for more than 100 years before Europeans, and there would be a major rollover with that. And that was Folsom, New Mexico. But that had a lot of debates. That took a lot of science to say, yeah, we think people have been here for tens of thousands of years. But that would be our colleagues' push back to those type of questions. Yeah.
ah,
Just that's why your fields are so important, just
yeah.
the data. But you're talking about fraud in anthropology, salting it or Piltdown Man. And Stephanie, I wanted to ask you also, when you have a criminal who's committed a crime and now they're trying to hide it, It seems to me the more they know about your science, the more they can try to doctor a site to push the evidence one way on a false trail or this trail, or hide it, or eliminate it, or whatever. Do you find, do you have to think about that in terms of when you're analyzing a case?
Well, you know, when I used to do lectures on just forensic stuff and to talk about the things that we do, I was wondering, am I just teaching people to be better criminals?
Yeah.
And I don't think so. I don't really think so. I think, yeah, they kind of have an idea of what some of the technologies that we use are, but I don't think they have enough grasp of how they actually work to actually circumvent a
I
lot
see.
of that kind of stuff.
We were asking Michael Langlois the same, biblical archaeologist in script, and he was talking about art fraud cases, or he was talking about cases of
Dead Sea Scrolls.
faking
The Dead-
some scroll fragments because they're so valuable,
Mhm.
and having to think in those terms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And Chris, you were going to tell us a bit more about the artifacts found with Utsi, which is so rare to find artifacts preserved in the ice of the Alps. And now things are melting, and we're finding more and more of these finds. And there's a race on to collect them before the air and the exposure to the warmer environment. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and about Utsi?
Oh,
Is there
I
a
was
lot
just
of
gonna say his quiver, which is made out of animal hide, and so that wouldn't preserve unless you're in a glacier or extreme rock shelter in a dry environment. But yeah, so his quiver for his arrows, his bow were absolutely fantastic. Those are easier to stabilize. We call it stabilizing. So museum people do that. But Otzi, the problem they had was he started mildewing. They had to put him back in a freezer to preserve him. And so, but again, we can get these normally soft tissue, either being a fur or plant material, deteriorates very quickly. So he had these plants. He was carrying plants with him. He had the bow and arrow. What else did he have? He had his parka, so he had really nice clothing. He had really nice shoes for the glaciers that were stuffed with plants for insulation as he's climbing in a cold environment. So he had really excellent. He also had a sewing kit, a needle and sewing kit. So if he had to
To
make a
repair
repair
on
on
the
his
go?
clothing, on his,
Yeah.
yeah. And so again, because the preservation was so good, they had ended up going through and having to do a big excavation around him, and they end up finding all these cool artifacts. But yeah, he had a sewing kit on him, which I think in the Ice Age would be the number one thing you want to have with you. He also had stuff, I think he had flint, didn't he, for making fires. He had fire starters with him. Yeah, he was a backpacker in many ways, carrying what he needed to do his trading and moving along.
That's fascinating. Don't you wish all that soft material was much more of it that came down to us? But
Would we continue to eliminate this idea of ancestors not having technology?
No,
That we continue to realize that
pretty
these,
sophisticated.
yeah, that
Yeah.
amazing stuff that we keep thinking, well, they couldn't have known that. Well, they knew something that we didn't know. We're still discovering it
Yeah.
now, and they had it then. How many types of wood was in his?
Oh, Todd, talk to that, because the different woods that composed his quivers, his bow, he used the right wood for the right job.
Yeah.
So they intimately knew their materials and how best to use them. That is fascinating. You want to speak to that? You're a tool expert.
You've been
I'm not sure I have much to add beyond what you just simply said. I mean, people are. I tell my class that it's never a good idea to bet against people's intelligence. If your hypothesis rests on, and then people were stupid, you're unlikely to be correct. And so, as a result, yes, absolutely, his technology was extremely well structured for his environment, which is why he was able to live as best as he could. He had been injured earlier on. I don't know all the details because they've done some amazing discussions, but apparently he had the blood of 3 individuals on him in addition to his own, and he'd been involved in some sort of combat prior to his death. But I couldn't tell you all of the information on that stuff because of
And there was
I
a
just simply don't know it.
splint in his hip or somewhere, right?
That's a
And yeah, he had 3 different wounds. there had been another individual he had helped. There's blood along his side where he had helped carry somebody who was leaning on him for support, and he had a considerable amount of blood from that individual. But again, I'm more likely to tell you all wrong stuff than I'm to tell you right. So
Well,
I'm
that
gonna
just means
And
that
Stephanie-
they should be watching that site because it sounds like there's more individuals to find there,
absolutely.
Could be, yeah.
right? His
Now,
comments. his
kind of just
following
thinking
comments.
about culture and people's attitudes towards death, and maybe Tony can speak to this. I saw there was a news article probably, I think 2 months ago or so, and somebody had started putting, you could pay to have a vial of your ashes put on the moon.
Oh,
And the
right,
Navajo had sued to stop that
right.
because for the Navajo, the moon or
The
the
moon is
Dene,
sacred
the
ground.
moon is sacred, and putting people on the moon was
Yeah.
like a terrible, 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 terrible
Well,
idea.
the thing is, bones can have bad spirits, and you could then be putting bad spirits with bad things happening on the moon, which could impact the planet. But yeah, the Dene, we're definitely concerned about that.
And I don't, and again, maybe Tony didn't follow the story, maybe he did, but my recollection is that 2,000 remains of 2,000 people were put there, but there was an agreement for some sort of a moratorium on placing additional bodies on the moon, and so ashes. And so I don't know. I guess where I'm going with this is that this reflects the differences in terms of kind of attitudes towards the dead. For a lot of folk, being put on the moon would be kind of a cool thing, and you could point up there and say, "Hey, your grandpa's up there" or whatnot. Whereas for other people, it's like, "Dude, what are you thinking? Don't do that. That's
Yeah.
incredibly stupid."
Well,
Yeah.
people sprinkling their remains at Chaco Canyon is one reason why so many of the great houses have been closed off.
Yeah, people continue, yeah.
Yeah.
In
Wow.
innocence, people do some dumb things. So, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
What
Well,
was the big case you were interviewed about on some kind of documentary, Stephanie? There was some
I'm
big
gonna
case.
let Todd and Chris take a
Yeah.
break. So thank you
Thank you
so,
so much
you
for all
guys
that you
always add so
added.
much to discussions and yeah.
Really pulled in the archaeology
Yeah, and it helped us
aspect.
understand,
Thank you.
yeah. And I want to give Stephanie a chance here. Go ahead, Stephanie.
So that was a case that happened in early 2000s, I believe it was. So there were a number of these were young people in high school and decided they wanted to bring back the old mob ways. Started their own little mob culture, and they ended up killing one of their friends,
Oh,
and took him out into the desert. They took him out there to kill him, killed him, and then sort of buried him in this desert area. And I went out to assist the Boulder City Police Department in excavating his remains once they found them.
Oh my gosh.
So,
How would you even know where to look? I mean, how did that unfold?
well, so the desert is a really hard place to bury people, especially in the Vegas area. You know, you're going to hit caliche and all of that wonderful stuff. And this was in a dry lake bed, so it's a lot of the area there is almost like concrete. They actually had dug a hole, and I don't know how long it took them, but they did dig a hole to put him in prior to taking him out there to killing him, and they couldn't find it. So then once they had actually killed him, they had to come up with a different hole. They attempted a number of spots. You could see the shovel marks where they had tried to dig a hole in other places and stuff, and they finally ended up getting him into the ground a little bit, but not very far. And what I'm remembering is that a lot of people go out there with their ATVs.
right.
And so there's this nice little, when there's little ramps and stuff, you can catch air and things like that. And apparently they came across the body, and I think it's just his toes were sort of sticking out. And somebody took a moment to look at what was there in the ground and said, "I think that's a body," and called the police. So it was it's one of those luck things. A lot of times we're finding people, it's just a matter of luck. Dogs are really good at finding people when they're sort of out in woodsy areas. A dog will come trotting back with something. So in this case, it was just sort of this luck of they were there. If they had actually been able to bury him in the deep hole, it might have been something that remained unfound. Yeah. So yeah, a lot of times it's kind of a luck thing where you're finding the only searches I've been part of where they were searching for somebody they thought might be out there, we never found anything. So
So once you find the body and then you go through the effort of identifying it, that would seem pretty easy, right? Because you've got, or how do you?
Well,
Like,
it seems pretty easy, but it's kind of, you know, it involves a lot of chance there again too. So
Ah.
once we found the body, in this case, I didn't need to do skeletal. I just went out for the excavation. I didn't actually have to do any kind of examination of the skeleton and stuff.
Mhm.
But yeah, once you've got it in there, then it comes time to get as much information from the remains that you can to put a profile together to get out to the world to say, hey, do you know who this person might be?
And their parents would obviously put in a missing person report.
Yeah.
So then you go to that and check it out. So once you identify this kid, then you what? Go to his friends, reconstruct his life, start to go, what happened? How
Yeah.
does that take place?
That's when the police investigation starts, and they go out and they start doing all the legwork, go out and talk to people
Mhm.
who saw this kid, who does he associate with,
Mhm.
what are his activities and habits and those sorts of things to put
Traders
together that.
confess, or what happened there? How did you put the story together?
That one I don't know. I don't, because once I was done with the body, wasn't part of any of the investigation and stuff like
Unlike
that.
the TV
Yeah.
They'd probably
show.
tell you in the show.
Oh my.
Yeah, yeah.
And then what happened to those kids, right?
So they're actually, I know that the kids are in jail, and I think that they just had a parole and it was denied for one of them. I think the sort of the leader of the group. I think so. They're still in jail.
Yeah.
I mean, how then you have to ask the questions, how do people do this? What is the motivation? How do you how do you get this gang of kids to agree to do this? How do you go through with
He
it?
does through history. We don't, you're asking
Yeah.
a good question. I know the
Ah.
psychology of it all and human,
Yeah,
yeah, it just goes, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
my.
Wow.
So,
Well, Stephanie, I truly appreciate you taking
Thank
time
you.
today to kind of educate us in this field, because I mean, it's sort of almost on the edge of what some of us consider gruesome and we don't want to know, but you know, like I can't imagine myself going to a site like you've described and what you've had to go through. But then again, you're one of those, your physiology is different, your psychology is different. You don't dream about this. It doesn't affect you in a scary way or whatever. You said, this is my job and I do this. And so, I
And
think
I think it's in service
it
to
is
the
in
loved
service.
ones,
It is in service
isn't
to
it?
us and humanity be able to understand. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely.
tell
Yeah.
a story. Tell us a little bit about your love of story as well,
Oh,
and
yeah.
myth.
Let's end with that. That would be great.
Yeah.
Well, I actually think that that's what makes us human. Anthropologists is, what is it that makes us human? What is that unifying thing? And we've gone through all sorts of tool makers, whatever. We're not the only ones that do that. Language, well,
Mhm.
for me, it's that story. It's the ability to create a story. We tell stories to teach, and we love to listen to stories to learn, and those sorts of things. So I feel like that's sort of the central core of what our humanness is. So that's what it is to me
I
anyway.
agree.
Is that story, and just giving us things to help us understand and give us meaning for why we're even here. We've got this big brain that gets us thinking, and it's always thinking and going and all that kind of stuff. And to me, story is what sorts all of that out. And that relates back to the puzzle solving of forensic stuff. Is there's a story and it needs to be told. You got to give voice to all of that kind of stuff to find out what's going on. So it's the core of everything.
I also like to look at the story that we're telling in the subtext. What does it all mean? Do you look at what our culture, the story that we're telling about our universe and our place in it and who we are, and compared to some of the myths that you study? Because at the Anthropology of Consciousness conference, you gave a lovely talk on the myths evolving around the total eclipse that we were about to see. So do you really look at our culture and compare and contrast to previous cultures? I think that's a fascinating story. We've had a lot of talks with the Van Pools about that as well.
Well,
But
to me, the myth, looking at the myths,
let me
and
see it, please.
it's basically to me it's the evolution of our culture. So you can look
Yeah.
at the story that sort of gives you how our culture's changed. That what I was using was looking at the notion that as we get a scientific understanding, then those things become irrelevant. Well, they don't. That's not true. They change.
Mhm.
They
Yeah.
know, they're still relevant. It's just how we look at them changes. So looking at the evolution of mythology is also looking at how our culture has changed as well.
Yeah. Any deep insights on that? Aren't we being shaped? Are we shaping our technology, or is our technology shaping us?
Yeah, that's
Right.
the question, and I don't know that we have a good answer for that. It's which came first. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
It's too tangled and complicated to figure all that out.
yeah.
And of course, there's the famous quote, "The universe is made of stories, not of atoms." And I always thought that was
The favorite one.
yeah.
Yeah.
It says.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
It's a good
Any
one.
questions or comments? Ask
Yeah.
them now as we wind up. This is a delightful conversation, and yeah, very far afield. And I want to thank Chris and Todd for adding so much
Yeah.
from their work as well to build out this whole story of.
Tony did ask you in the chat room. He said, "What is your presentation next time around going to be on under the category of magic? How are you
The
going to
ma-
tie
the
your
magic
world to
in
the
this-
world of magic?"
You know what? I haven't come up with anything yet. I'm still thinking about it, so I don't know for sure
Yes.
what I want to talk about. But
That's the theme.
Aren't you you're heading the program of the upcoming Anthropology of Consciousness conference?
yeah, I'm the program chair, so we'll be putting it together with my committee with Todd and Christine helping me. They so graciously offered. Yes.
Uh,
That's
well,
exciting.
Chris, can we bring you back and talk a little bit about magic?
Okay.
Because, this is the whole thought from our early ancestors. If you were to pluck them out of the timeline and set them down to today, so the story goes, they would look around and go, "Oh, you've just made magic realized," right? Like what the tools that we have today would look like magic to cultures that didn't have these tools. And I'm thinking that they had magic and tools that they utilize, the internal technology that still look like magic to us. I turned that one around on its head
Mhm.
because I think that their abilities and consciousness look magical. We term it as magic when really it might have been just everyday to them because their bandwidths were open in certain ways. We're opening certain bandwidths, they had bandwidths open that our culture has deemed forbidden for whatever purposes. So I think this definition of magic gets back to the theme of this today, which is, can we see further and farther? Can we have agency that we can utilize by that opening of our perception and our abilities? Can we use consciousness and some of the avenues afforded to us in all of life that maybe we have laid aside and forgotten that were once well utilized?
Yeah.
That's, I think, our quest.
Yeah.
But and Chris, since you're part of this program coming up of magic, do you want to come back and
Yeah. Well,
and
and
talk to this?
Chris and Todd
Get-
can visit us in person, so we're going to have a round table.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Can I ask a quick question though, but before I turn over to Chris here? So, Stephanie, I'm curious, and please only answer if you care to, if you wish to. But a lot of times, the folks I've dealt with who deal with the dead, is in terms of forensics and whatnot, actually have magical practices they use for themselves in the sense of a lot of times it seems as if, and it's not always, but a lot of times there's a purification ritual they go through themselves. And I wonder if you or folks that you work with are involved in that sort of magic, just sort of to either protect the dead or to purify yourself or to interact with the dead in positive ways. Is that something that you've
Keep
seen
that
in your
veil up.
experience?
Yeah, that's
You know,
a
I
really
had
intriguing question.
I knew a girl that she had tattoos. They were, I want to say they were Pacific Islander sorts of tattoos that were for warding off evil that were on her hands so that she was dealing with death. It was stuff that wouldn't come up into her. So I've seen that sort of thing.
Mhm.
I don't have anything that I've ever done, and I almost feel like it's because I feel like I walk in both of those worlds, and I'm okay to.
Mhm.
Actually, Paul had just said something about dreams. I do have lots of dreams about that sort of stuff. They're never frightening. They're never scary. definitely if other people heard them, they would be kind of horrified by some of the things that I dream about. But I feel like to me, it's that I can walk in that world so that I can tell people about what it is that you need me to tell, you being the deceased need me to tell. So to me, it's almost like it's a practitioner type of thing, even though I don't have any kind of ritual or magic to go.
In
along
ancient
with
times,
that.
you would be a priestess, right?
Yeah.
With a particular role to do that. And so maybe this is the modern day version
Yeah.
of a very old lineage and role.
Yeah. Yeah. I just don't need the ritual or any of those sorts of things to
Mhm.
go through it and feel safe. I just sort of feel like I belong there.
Oh,
Interesting.
We talked to Elizabeth Fournier some time ago, who's an undertaker, about how to create green burials and rituals for people. It seems similar to that. She felt that I am destined to help help these last wishes take place in a beautiful and ceremonial way and assist the families. It seems similar. So some of us are just born to these roles like you are.
And final
Wow.
thoughts, you asked Chris a question about,
Oh, magic.
oh, yeah.
You talked about magical practices and rituals. So this is something that,
Will
yeah.
dovetail beautifully.
With all the great discussions going on, lost a little track or the windedness of it all. What was your question again?
We actually changed the topic a little bit, Laura, to come back to it. We
Well,
talked about,
well, playing on Todd's
Right.
question as well, how much magic's involved? And this is where a lot of religion and ritual and practice have come from, about mitigating our relationship with the dead and with the afterlife, right? So much. And so maybe putting this into context, yeah, this is just part of our culture making peace with that crossing over with our relationship with the dead, isn't it? This is a
I would say
modern
that's
version
just
of a very old
probably-
practice.
I was gonna say that's probably worldwide what we call religious practices. It does not need to be magical practice. So I think that's where I'm getting a little confused with just saying I'm a little confused this morning. But yeah, and so we do have people that do magical practices in the ancient world with necromancy and that type of stuff, but that's not what we're talking about right now. And so do you want to add something to that, Todd?
So there are these cases where people, in terms of dealing with the dead, will have certain rituals that are actually designed to help protect the dead crossing over. And so a lot of times these are for the benefit of the dead. So in Egypt, they'll have these little figurines that they're called demons, but that's not really a very good term in the sense of they're not what we would think of as demons, but what they are these spirits.
Embodiments.
And they're these objects, and you can put runes on them or hieroglyphics and whatnot that will actually help the individual cross over into the land of the dead. So a lot of times in a lot of cultures, this transition between living and dead is seen as very dangerous. The Cherokee, for example, and Chris can talk more about this, have this concept of basically a soul eater or a dog that will devour the mind and basically destroy that which is the person during this transition. And so there's a lot of things you can do to help people get across the bridge into the land of the dead. And so I guess where I'm going with this is that there's a lot of variation around the world in terms of how to do this, but it's a liminal phase that's very potentially dangerous for the people who are involved, both for the person themselves who's died, but also for the folks around them. One of the things that I noticed with Stephanie when she was talking about this is that and please correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but she sort of sees herself as part of this in the sense of as kind of the speaker for the dead or whatever, helping to figure out what happened to a person. I think she sort of sees herself, if I understood her correctly, as a part of this in a sense of doing service for the dead to help the dead transition in a meaningful way and to help their relatives also with that transition.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Appreciate your time today, everybody. So
Yeah,
this has
thank
been
you for
fascinating.
jumping in.
Giving me a lot of insight into yeah.
Yeah. Stephanie, thank you very much. And we appreciate so much this insight into a world that most of us don't have any access to other than.
When our time comes.
Yeah, right.
Maybe may it be a happy crossing. Yeah.
Exactly.
So
All right. Well, thank you. And we're gonna,
thank you. All right. Appreciate it. Bye now.